Today on The State of Us, does America need more states? Should Congress have fewer elections? Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined, of course, today by the friendly redneck liberal and senior resident historian here at True Chat, Mr. Lance L. Jackson. Today, we get to look at the possibility of breaking up America's largest states and the benefits that might bring for Democrats and Republicans. We're also going to talk about congressional elections. We are one of the only democracies in the world that has 2-year congressional elections. Why do we have those? And are they really for the best? Well, we're going to endeavor to answer those questions today. But before we do, what is the word of the day?
Well, we're going back to the beginning of the alphabet, and we're going to choose something from the letter A. And the word of the day is asseverate. A-S-S-E-V-E-R-A-T-E. 4 syllables, obviously there. It is a transitive verb. And it means to assert strongly or to state seriously or positively. Asseverate can also be used as a noun, asseveration.
Asseverate. So I could say, I will asseverate this statement.
Yes, but that doesn't count as your first time because that's an example. In my
I'm just asking.
Yes, that is true.
Just making sure.
Still 0-0.
Okay.
All right.
It's all tied up.
Because my examples never count, even though I give like 4 or 5 great examples.
That's right.
That they don't count.
Well, that's not my rule.
And then Justin steals them later in the show, and then he ekes out a narrow victory using my examples.
It was handed down from on high from our producer.
I'm going to quit giving examples and make Justin come up with his own ways to use the word. See how many victories he gets that way.
We will see. I ought to be able to win since I found this word. But
he's going to brag now.
That's
that
not
it's
a guarantee.
I'm always the one that picks the word, but I let him pick today, and so
it's
now,
4 syllables, so I'll probably lose.
So
I wouldn't put my money on me.
I like today's topic, right? Because if you listen to our show, you're going to think, well, your friendly redneck liberal, he's obviously this is a change, so he's against it. There are parts of this that I like. Now, you are right. There are parts of it that I don't like that I think, no, that's dumb. We should keep it. This is okay.
And I'm sure you'll be sure to asseverate that opinion anytime that you disagree with.
I asseverate every opinion. I am full of asseverations.
Asseverations.
Anytime I speak, I am full of asseverations as I asseverate my opinion.
Okay. Now I was just criticized.
That was just a
1 or 2
Justinism.
episodes ago for using it 3 or 4 times in the same sentence. All right.
But no, I like this topic because it's a new idea that I actually like part of it.
We've talked about adding states, right? I mean, I've been on this thing for a few years and we've covered it a few times that, we ought to have more than 50 states and why don't we? And we've entertained that in a number of scenarios, but today we get to entertain it in a new scenario because we've talked about it from the standpoint of adding territories of the United States, right? As states, for example, Puerto Rico or Guam, or obviously the District of Columbia are all items that we've discussed before. American Samoa, right? We've talked about different territories that might want to be a state. So we've talked about it in that sense. We've talked about it in opening statehood to maybe other countries who would be interested in joining the Union. But today we're going to talk about it in the sense of, well, there is another way that you could have more states. You could break up some of our existing states. And you might say, whoa, we can't break up states. We can't do that. That'd be wrong. Well, I mean, we've been doing it almost since the beginning of our country. So we started with the 13 colonies, right? And then since that point, we've been adding states. How do you think we got to 50 states, right? The last time, the addition of Alaska and Hawaii in 1959, that was the last time that we added a state, so about 70 years ago. And America hasn't increased the number of states, and unless some future president winds up buying Greenland, according to the article, they think they're funny, the United States is unlikely to expand territorially. Nonetheless, it continues to expand demographically. Since 1960, the country has added over 150 million people through a combination of immigration and natural population increase, and yet we haven't upped the number of states.
And you would say, well, why does that matter, right? I mean, we double in size. Why does it matter whether or not we have added any new states? Well, because the article goes on to point out that since 1980, about 40% of America's population growth is in 3 megastates: California, Texas, and Florida. So now, okay, we are growing, right? But we're growing in certain areas. And now here's where your government class back in high school comes in. If you remember, every state is allowed the same number of senators. And I think every time you pick up the paper, or I'm sorry, nobody picks up the paper, you pick up your phone and you read your news feed, you hear something about the Senate. And I'm sure Justin's going to get into that. But I want to just point out one thing. You talk about changing from basically 1790 to 1960, we added approximately 35 states, meaning one every 5 years. And in the last...
So we're not really doing very well at keeping up with that.
In the last 60 years, we've added 0. I mean, so when you talk about the change component, people are like, oh, we can't do this. Well, wait a minute. For the first, around 170, 175 years, we were a country. We added a state on average every 5 years. And when you talk about, now we talk about these mega states, you have to also remember, Kentucky was formed out of other states. West Virginia was formed out of another state. Maine was formed out of another state. The Dakotas were a territory, and we made 2 states plus partials. Again, the history is there to make states from existing states, not just necessarily new land.
Yeah, since 1980, about 40% of America's population growth has occurred in only 3 megastates, and that's the ones you mentioned: California, Texas, and Florida. And California has now more than 8 times the population of the median U.S. state. On its own, Los Angeles County would be the 10th largest state in the union. The 4 largest states, I'm going to attempt to asseverate this to the maximum extent possible. The 4 largest states by population now make up roughly 1/3 of the population of the United States. That's more, by the way, than the 34 smallest states put together. So if you put together the 34 smallest states, Lance, they don't equal the 4 largest states. Now, if that is not as clear as can be an issue of the breakup of the power, I don't know what is. And you might say, well, what do you mean the power, right? Because who really has more power in that equation? Well, there's a couple different ways to look at it. I think the article does a relatively good job, Lance, right, of pointing out that one obvious way to look at it, for example, if you're in the great state of California, is you might frown upon those 34 states and say, well, wait a minute, it's not fair that as a state that has 1/50th the population of our great state, that you have 2 senators and I have 2 senators. That doesn't seem fair, And the small state might look at California and say that it's not fair because you on your own would be one of the world's largest economies, and you make decisions all the time that my people never vote on and never have any say in, and then your companies have to abide by those decisions, which affects how I have to live. And so,
man, these sound like the same arguments that James Madison and everybody had back at the Constitutional Convention.
You mean this isn't new, Lance?
I don't think so.
Oh, okay.
I mean, just listening to you, you sound an awful lot like, the small states and the big states, the old Virginia plan versus the New Jersey plan that we all learned about in 8th grade or 10th
bicameral
grade
structure,
legislature, right?
Mm-hmm. Because why do we, in case listeners don't know, right? That's the whole reason that we have a Senate and a House, which is unusual when you look at a lot of other, quote unquote, democracies or republics around the world. Many of them do not have that structure. But one of the reasons we have it is because the other thing that makes us unique is being, originally speaking, and technically still are, a confederation of many states, a union of multiple, small countries, sovereign states, so to speak, that gave away some of their power in the name of mutual benefit, mutual protection, mutual governance.
In history, which is known as the Great Compromise. So if you're now starting to go, oh, I remember Mr. Jones back in 8th grade history. Yeah, this is what we're talking about, people. And we're talking about adapting that. And also, to your point, another reason why we were able to go to bicameral is we were familiar with it being colonies of England with the House of Commons and the House of Lords. So there was a little bit of a structural
something to draw from
there that we could draw from. And people would say, oh, okay, so it's different from England, but it's kind of the same. So we're a little comfortable with it. We're a little more comfortable with that concept or idea.
Because they're a wonky one too, just for what it's worth.
Right, they're outside the norm, So we're kind of following that model as well, as the fact that, to your point, both sides were afraid of one side having too much power, so we're going to try to split the powers.
Yeah. So, but that brings us to that notion of, is there an inordinate imbalance? They were worried about it then, but the scale that we're talking about is probably not even something that they would have fathomed,
well,
right?
They couldn't imagine it because we only went to the Appalachian Mountains.
Right.
We didn't even exist very far, and it was like, okay. Their problem was still north and south, the slavery and freedom and all that kind of stuff, large plantation owners, cotton farming versus the industrial north. But wait a minute. You mean we've always had issues within the framework of our nation? Yes. And how do we solve them? Oh, we added other states. So is it time to do that again? As we, to me, that's the big issue here, is when slavery looked like it was going to divide the nation in 1820, Henry Clay came up with the Missouri Compromise, and we add Missouri as a slave state and Maine from Massachusetts as a free state, and we keep the balance of power the same. Oh, and we kept the nation together. So, is this a partial solution to maybe getting us back to where we're going to work for the common good instead of split like we are now in many cases on many issues? I don't know.
Well, and in places where people don't feel represented by their state, it may help them feel better represented and possibly their interest better secured. And we're going to talk about a few examples from the article where they said, well, what might it look like if you split up California or New York? And how would that benefit everybody, right? And when we say everybody, we mean Democrats and Republicans. How could it benefit both sides? Well, to find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. New York City. It currently lacks many powers that are crucial to management, like it doesn't have full control of its transportation system. Some of you might be sitting there and be surprised by that. You would think that the mega city would be able to control its own transportation, but alas, it cannot. If, as part of a larger national reorganization, New York City were to become a city-state, like Berlin, for example, it could assume most of those powers, while its senators in Washington could focus on a national agenda relevant to urban America. Inasmuch as New York City needs partners to coordinate with, the most important ones are in New Jersey and Connecticut, not in Buffalo or Rochester. So splitting up New York State could add momentum to proposals for regional governance across state lines. Meanwhile, upstate New York would have a much better chance at pursuing its own development in ways that suit its commonality with other Rust Belt regions without being captive to the needs and preferences of a city with which it has little in common economically since the near obsolescence of the Erie Canal. New York is a good example of, and if you've been to New York, there's New York City and then there's the state of New York, and those are not the same thing, And I think it's a perfect example of you have two parts of the state being held hostage to the other part of the state unable to move forward because what New York City needs is very different from what most of upstate New York needs.
Right. And, if this has piqued your interest a little bit, you might say, well, what do we have to do this? I mean, obviously, we're going to need a constitutional amendment or what laws we have to change. Well, I cannot asseverate strongly enough the fact that no constitutional amendment would be required. Reading Article 4, creating states from existing states would merely require the state legislature to vote to split up and for Congress to assent. And unlike consolidating smaller states, which would reduce their citizens' reputation, splitting up the large states would increase representation, giving their voters a reason to be supportive of the idea. Now, so there you have it, okay? All New York has to do is decide to do this, and Congress approve it. There doesn't need to be a constitutional amendment. I like this idea of splitting up states. They talk about California. For most of us, and this was even, again, historically representative, California, when it was first admitted, the southern states wanted it to be split in half. They wanted a Northern California and a Southern California so as to keep the balance of slavery and push slavery to the West. And what we do, we had another compromise of 1850. Again, the last hurrah of what I believe one of the most interesting Americans in history, especially if you put in the fact that was never elected president, even though they ran multiple times, Henry Clay. Henry Clay comes up with a compromise that allows California to come in as a free state, and we're going to, enforce the fugitive slave law more, and we're going to give the disputed land between Texas and New Mexico to New Mexico, and then we're going to give Texas $10 million for the land that they lost. And so so my point is, we've done this kind of stuff before. This isn't new. This isn't a totally new concept. And I kind of like the dividing up of the states. And, you can comment on that, Justin. What I don't like, because I told you there are parts of this I don't like. I don't like the idea of city states. I don't like the concept of Los Angeles being a state, San Francisco being a state, New York City being a state. That I just don't like. I don't know. It just doesn't sound right to me that a city gets represented as a state. Now, is it done throughout Europe? Yeah, that's probably why I don't want it, because I don't want to be like Europe. Because we constantly have to go in and bail Europe out in our history. And it's like, I don't want to be European. I like being American. So, there's the redneck in me.
Well, Asia has, like Singapore, right?
Right.
City states they're not theoretical things.
Well, see, you can argue with me and try to
places.
convince me, but I like the idea of taking up, dividing Texas into different states, California into different states, even New York into different states. But I don't know. I can't wrap my head around city states.
Well, we've talked about,
even though I know there's enough people, right?
You support statehood for DC. Technically wouldn't be a city state.
Well,
it would be in the respect that the district is not very big.
To your point, Ohio is one of the more populated states in the union. But if you just take New York City, the city of New York has almost as many people as the entire state of Ohio. So, I understand the lack of strong rationale for my opinion. You're just
going to asseverate it anyway.
Exactly. That's just where I am. I'm okay to divide these land masses up who have lots of people into states, because I really see that point of dividing that power in the Senate, not making the Senate, whether you're a Democrat or Republican. I don't want the Senate to dictate as much as they do. And not adding new states, but creating states from existing states, those people, I'm thinking of my relatives and friends who live in California. My two senators have just as much power as their two senators. And I don't even know what the population is.
Everybody's senators have, each person who is a senator has more power today than they did, and less oversight than they did 70 years ago. Because
exactly.
There are 150 million new people, and there are the same amount of senators, which means just for everybody, whether you're in California, Ohio, wherever you are, you are less represented today than you were 70 years ago.
We've doubled in population in the last 70 years, and our government body is the same size. So we've lost half of our representation.
Right. We've given away half of our individual power to oversee our government.
We could go to 200 senators. We'd have to go to 200 senators to just equal the amount of power we had as American citizens back in 1960. Well, especially when you make the argument like we do all the time, and through our many listeners who agree with, they tell us they agree with us, we're frustrated with the lack of the government to get anything done. Well, could this be one of the reasons? Because there's not as wide representation. So you now create the polars of the existence, the ultra conservatives and the ultra liberals. And those of us who believe in the middle ground, we no longer can get anything done because the size and structure of our government allows for these minority groups on each end to dictate what the government can do. So by expanding the size of the government, I know that I even hate to say that, right? By expanding the size,
expanding our representation,
not the government, the that's a representation. Great point by my partner there. We're going to expand the size of representation. We now create a bigger middle who now can get things done against the polar opposites.
And you know what? To the polar opposites out there, hopefully some of them are listening. I would hope so. But maybe
we
not.
Try to talk to
they
them.
might be hate listening.
Well,
but
we want to have the conversation, right? I mean, so if you disagree with this, let us know. Send us an email at at podcast@thestateofus.org. Let us know how you feel, why this doesn't make sense. Who doesn't want more representation?
But I think even to them, Lance, there's a point to be said of if there were more states, right, you would have more options of what type of rules and places that you want to live under. And so you might actually have places where you could get some more of what you want if that's, if there's a place that offers that sort of lifestyle, you might be better represented. Because, I mean, the reality is, as much as the fringes are influencing the inability of the middle to do things, they're also really not getting most of the time much of what they want. They do a lot of complaining,
which is why they
do a lot of stopping.
Right. Which is why we're at a standstill.
Right.
Nothing is happening.
But they don't often get hardly anything that they want either.
Another fair point.
The point of nobody's really getting very much of what they want, and we're not making hardly any progress. So wouldn't it be better if everybody was getting some of what they wanted than what we have right now, where everybody's getting almost nothing of what they want? And I think that this, to your point, this may be a way. We've talked a lot about the Senate, though. We kind of have to shift gears now and talk about the House because,
do we have to?
Well, we don't have to.
Okay.
But
we're going to?
We're going to.
Okay. All right.
I think.
I think the Senate's just much more interesting than the House is, but that's okay.
You'd be a senator and not a House of
especially when there's
Representatives
only
member.
100 of us and I have twice as much power as I would have had the year I was born.
That's right. That's right. I mean, it's appealing to be a senator,
why would I
right?
not be a senator? I have twice as much power.
Well,
as I would have had 70 years
Joe
ago.
Manchin is a perfect example of the power of one senator.
He's stopping everything that a president wants to do. So why wouldn't you want to be a senator, right?
Yeah. I mean,
now, it is an interesting scenario in that, the Senate is split, but again, should one person hold up what everybody wants to do? And obviously, if you're against what's being done, you say, yes, because I don't want that to happen. But is that the way a democracy should work? That one person gets to
hold everything,
the whole direction of a government? It's a good question.
So, and that might be a different equation, right? If there were more senators.
Or less likely to happen, right? Less likely to occur.
Yes. It's harder to concentrate the power when there are more of you, which I think is well taken in the House, right? And you're talking about a democracy, right? We don't want an autocracy. Right.
We don't want where one person gets to rule. That's the whole idea of a democracy, right? Is that you have the majority represented. And you can very well, through the math, show that the majority is not represented. 40% of the population is in 3 states. Those 3 states do not have a majority in our congressional activity.
Nope. And I think the point from the article is well taken too. They asseverate that, in a state like Florida, which is becoming more consistently red, where in California, for example, you may benefit from, you break it up and maybe it benefits liberals, but it benefits, conservatives as well, probably liberals more so. But in Florida, it would be, the opposite. You'd benefit conservatives more than you would liberals, but liberals would gain a little bit because the people that are forgotten in Southern Florida, would have some real live representation.
Well, they actually point out, right, that Northern Florida would probably be Republican, Southern Florida around Miami would be Democratic, and Central Florida around Orlando would be a purple.
Mm-hmm.
So you actually don't help anybody.
Yeah.
I mean,
you better represent everybody, but nobody loses out.
Right. Nobody loses any power.
Yeah. It's only positive for everybody involved. There's no negative. Because again, with this, you don't lose senators, right? Like Northern Florida, it gets its 2 senators, and Central Florida would get its 2 senators. And so, Florida goes from 2 to 6 senators. So what else could be done? We fixed the Senate. We need more states. How about fixing the House? Is the House broken? Well, I don't know. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll find out. Lance likes the Senate. He has asseverated as much, and not so much the House. But one of the reasons, honestly, that I don't like the House, and I think there's a lot of people who don't, is because it's kind of raucous all the time, and it's hard to keep track of who's there and what they're doing, and can you really do much in 2 years? Well, it may surprise you to find out, but historically, Lance, right, there were a lot of people that wanted 1-year House terms. Annual. Can you imagine? I think about right now, I feel like we have a lot of elections, in this country all the time. And I think it's something we've discussed before about voter apathy. The more elections you have, the harder it can be to get people to participate because they start to get kind of disenfranchised with, is anything I'm doing really making a difference? If it comes around less often, I feel like it's more important. When it happens all the time, I get desensitized to it, and then I don't know if it's as important. That's a common, voter apathy issue for everybody, for both sides of the aisle. But this question of, it feels like we're in election cycle all the time now. Can you imagine if they were annual? And we weren't that far from having that happen, because actually the plan was to go to 3-year terms for the House, but the ones that wanted the single term held out, and then they compromised at 2-year terms. And that's how we ended up with 2-year House terms. But the article points out that this is unusual, not just in Europe, but basically almost every parliamentary system around the world. Most of them are 4 or 5-year terms, not 2-year terms. Partly because, what we observe in this country, which is that when a president takes office, it's basically accepted now. And we even talked about this when Biden was brought into office and back when Trump was. You basically get just under a year. That's what you get. And that's crazy to think about. Okay, you're elected to a 4-year term, but really, regardless of what party you are, regardless of what kind of mandate you have, if you look at the last 20 or 30 years, anything substantive that you're going to get done basically has to be in your first year. And then what are you doing for the next 3 years? What is our government doing for us for the next 3 years? Well, they're all busy running for office. That's what they're doing. So we get 1 year of work, and then we pay them for 3 years so that they can get hired again for 1 year so that then they can work again for another 3. Doesn't this kind of seem crazy that we do it this way? We all just kind of accept it because it's like, well, that's just how it is, and that's how it's always going to be. And wouldn't we have to, drastically change things to do this? And the answer is, well, not necessarily. Their Congress has broad latitude to determine how House elections take place. And yes, you might get into a constitutional amendment, but it might be worth it for everybody because it'd be easier on the politicians too, right?
As you've asseverated, the inefficiency is grossly obvious, right? You have a year and a half to get legislation through, and then you have the midterm elections, which historically in the 20th century means that your party starts to lose power, except, oh, wait a minute, now you're a lame duck, so nobody listens to you if you happen to win a second term because everybody knows you're on your way out. Why not you can keep the Senate every 6 years, so it's still kind of looked upon as the upper house, and even if we add different states and make representation more equal in the Senate, you can put the House every 4 years, run it concurrently with the presidential election so that if you have some coattails and drag in enough people with you and people like what your ideas are, that you then have 2 or 3 years to make changes and you don't have to worry about the midterm elections. New broom sweeps clean, right? We get a change of people there, which might bring new ideas. We don't get the old stick in the muds that still feel this way because once you get in the House, if you run again, you're 90% chance plus to get reelected just because the election happens so often and nobody has a chance to get name recognition to challenge you for that job. So if you went to a 4-year election, we'd spend less money on elections. We'd have more opportunity to get laws passed to move the country in whatever direction we wanted to try. And then if we didn't like the direction we were moving, we could get those people out and put in new ones instead of once you're elected, you're basically a member of the House for life as long as you want that job. Correct me, right? Podcast at thestateofus.org. What's wrong with that? I don't understand. And if you get somebody you like, then you reelect them every 4 years instead of every 2 years. I mean, it doesn't preclude someone. We're not talking about term limits here. We're just saying don't vote on them as often and let's wait instead of them telling us what they'd like to get done. Let's see what they do get done and how they do represent us instead of them coming back every other year and promising us what they will get done. And then us reelecting them on those promises. We can reelect them or get rid of them based on the job they do. Oh, isn't that the way we're all subjugated to at work? Don't we have performance reviews, right? And we're held to, well, did you perform or not perform?
Did you do the job you were hired to do?
Right. These people, well, they're 90% chance of keeping their job just because they have the job. That doesn't seem like that fits into any other realm of our existence.
That was an excellent asseveration, Mr. Lance Jackson. But I do think the one thing that was coming to mind as you were saying that is,
I may lose the battle, but I'm going to win the war.
You would have you would have a larger chance every 4 years of a referendum on not just the president, but also the House, because, part of what happens right now is it's like almost guaranteed, right? Like the midterms coming up here, that the Democrats will probably lose the House. Why? Because history tells us that it's voters' chance to say, yeah, they've put in some policies. I'm not really sure how I feel about these things, so let's change things up. And part of the problem with that is a lot of policies, right, don't have the opportunity to fully develop in that time. And if you were somebody that was a fan of the Trump administration's policies, in fairness, for example, some of the tax-related and business-related things, most of that hadn't even gone into effect when Democrats took control of the House. So, we passed all this stuff, but you haven't ever even felt the impact of it, and now you've replaced us, so you don't really know if it's any good or not, So it's just a very reactionary and not giving an opportunity for any side to bear out their policies to really see if anything's worth it. I think there's an upside and a downside to that, because one of the things that's pointed out that I guess is worth mentioning, and this is a really interesting concept, Lance, because they do it in lots of other democracies, we don't have it here, is the 2-year House term is that check, right, on power of saying, well, we don't want a president to be wild and free, or for Congress to go wild and free. And we like having that, kind of safety net of we can turn over things and make things harder 2 years in, because, for example, what's probably going to happen in this midterm is it's going to get handed to Republicans. So you'll have, you'll have a Democrat president, you'll probably have a Republican House, and you may have a Democrat or Republican Senate. Either way, you're going to have a government that, again,
for 2 years does absolutely nothing.
Exactly.
Because you don't have a veto-proof House. So
but
anything that does get through is going to be vetoed by the Democratic president, and then nothing gets done for 2 years. And who are the losers there? We, the American people.
And so there's this idea of, if it makes you nervous to get rid of the 2-year term because you lose that check on power, then we could subsequently institute the ability in government for a vote of no confidence, which is present in many other democracies, which basically allows our legislature, if a majority of the legislature votes in the affirmative, to essentially say, we're resetting. It requires that elections be held, and it's basically your opportunity to wipe everybody out and start over if that's what you want to do. Now, it doesn't guarantee it, and there's a lot of different ways that's done, but it's a concept that isn't used super frequently in other places, but it is that option that's there to say, hey, if this really isn't working, we can reset and we can start over. And I think it's an interesting concept because it requires the legislature has to do it. So they have to say things are bad enough that we need to reset, but it's also that kind of, it resets everybody, right? So it resets your opposition and you. So then everybody's back on the agenda as you're going to get elected based on the merits of what you say you want to do, but nobody's safe then, because it's not, we don't like the Republican Senate, so we're going to vote a no confidence just for them. It's no, everybody's going to get vote of no confidence. And now the government is a vote of no confidence. So it's a different concept, but one that we'd like to hear your thoughts on. You can send us an email, podcast@thestateofus.org. Some interesting concepts today, Lance.
We've given you all a lot to think about and to talk around the water cooler about here as you go into the rest of your work week. But that's what we're supposed to do here, right? Our mission here at True Chat is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And we've thrown out a multitude of ideas, and we want you to discuss those and share with your friends and your family and your coworkers. And when they say, well, this sounds like a pretty interesting show, I like to be intellectually stimulated on a daily basis. And so tell them they can find our show on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
The State of Us is available on Tuesdays and Thursdays as a podcast first thing in the mornings, and we're heard on radio stations around the country on the weekends. For The State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I think I take the win today.
I think you did. Like I said,
first time with a 4-syllable word.
You won the battle, but I think I won the war, as you so aptly put it, that I asseverated my position very well.
Is the war over? I think the war's still going. The 10-year war.
The 10-year war continues. There we go.
I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our producer, Bradley Butch. And of course, thank you all, our audience, for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.